Hello, and welcome to The Unconventional Traveler. Every week, we feature stories by some of the world's greatest explorers. And tonight, filmmaker George Butler will share with us the story of the Endurance, based on Sir Ernest Shackleton's remarkable last great journey in the heroic age of discovery in 1914, and perhaps the greatest adventure story of all time. George, tell us briefly the story of the Endurance.
There was something called the heroic age of discovery at the beginning of the last century, 1900. And there was a big race going on to the South Pole. Shackleton tried for that race, but turned back in order to save his men. In 1914, he decided he would be the first person to try and walk across the entire Antarctic continent. And he took 27 men to the Antarctic on a ship called the Endurance. The ship was crushed, and essentially for the next 2 years he was marooned on icebergs and small islands. And the remarkable part of this story is that 28 men survived 635 days of shipwreck and returned alive.
Well, why did you choose to direct this film, and what were your goals?
I chose to direct this film because I live with Caroline Alexander, who wrote the very good book, The Endurance, and curated the celebrated exhibit, which is touring America. But I also determined very early in the game, because I brought this story to her attention for the first time, that this was one of the greatest stories ever told. And it curdled every proper blood in a filmmaker's mind. And I determined very quickly to make a film out of this project. And in fact, I ended up making 4 films out of this project, all shot on location in the Antarctic. And it's probably the most remote motion picture shoot ever done in the history of film.
Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. Ernest Shackleton.
He was now 40 years old, and this was his last chance. On December 5th, 1914, the Endurance left the island and headed south. Miles from the continent when she entered a field of heavy brash ice, slowing the ship to a crawl. Captain Worsley recorded a fateful decision.
The character of the pack has again changed. The floes are very thick. We cannot push through except with a very great expenditure of power. We therefore prefer to lie to for a while to see if the pack opens at all when this northeast wind clears.
Now, did you retrace the steps that Shackleton and the crew actually took?
Very close to that, although there were overlaps between the shooting trips. Some of my crew went on one trip and some went on the other trip, but I went on both trips. So I think probably I've come closest to getting to the exact locations of Shackleton and his men of anyone alive at the moment. Although we did not go as far into the Weddell Sea as Shackleton went in 1914-15.
George, what were the keys to their survival?
Probably Shackleton's leadership was the main element in their survival. You have to remember that even though those men proved that they were remarkable after their long, enduring adventure in the Antarctic, they began as rather ordinary college graduates and merchant seamen and fishermen from Hull and places like that in England. But nothing in their upbringing had prepared them for the Antarctic. And for 28 men to be able to survive in very elementary clothes for 635 days, and we're talking temperatures of 40, 50 below zero, winds of 100 miles an hour, total darkness for a large part of each year, and great difficulty in securing food other than penguins and seals. It was the most remarkable survival story ever told. And I've been all over America showing this film, and at the end of every screening I ask the audience if they know a better survival story. I've never seen a single hand go up.
And what I find so interesting about the story is that obviously Shackleton was the ultimate hero, being the leader, but there were many heroes on this story.
Well, a great leader brings forth great bravery and great courage from his men. And Shackleton did have with him at the highest level of the trip some pretty remarkable people. Worsley is a remarkable navigator. Wild was the leader who could step in and take over from Shackleton. And the other men on the trip proved they were very able indeed. Even Chippy McNish, the carpenter on board, was an essential character.
On the 14th of February 1915, the temperature suddenly dropped from 20 degrees above zero to 20 degrees below it, and the whole sea froze over and we froze in with it.
An unexpected lead opened up 400 yards ahead, offering a chance to reach open water.
Of course, we had no explosive to blast our way out. We just had picks and shovels.
For 48 hours, the men attacked the ice. Shackleton insisted the men keep to a strict daily routine and carefully monitored their morale. The floating landscape, convulsed into pressure ridges, became more difficult to negotiate. Ice claimed their entire horizon. As they drifted, Shackleton was mindful of the fate of the ship Belgica. She also had been frozen for a winter in the pack, and her crew had succumbed to infighting and ultimately insanity.
What do you attribute Shackleton's great leadership qualities to?
Probably example would be the number one choice. He unerringly put himself in the most difficult position, if there was a difficult position to be in. One of the remarkable things that I note from the story is that when the small party of 3 boats was leaving the sea ice in the Weddell Sea and making their run for Elephant Island in open waters, none of the boats had any decking at all, so they were open. It was very severe weather. It was the turning point in the Antarctic winter, and those men were in open boats for 8 days, and I believe they were literally covered with ice. They are said to have had to chip their hands off the oars in order to be able to be replaced by the backup oarsmen. And their feet would have been in water the entire time. And I just don't know how you survive at 20 below zero in open boats on the sea with a wind that would have gotten under every bit of clothing you had. The entire time Shackleton was standing, and it's even said that he was awake for the entire trip, so that at any given moment on that particular part of the trip, any man would have been able to look and see his leader standing up and showing the way, as it were. But he was always the last person to take a drink of hot milk or something like that. He organized the trip so that he and his officers got the worst sleeping bags. and that is a very important thing to give up. And it's Shackleton's character, his generosity, his ability to detect when someone was really in bad shape and cheer them up is quite remarkable. He was also very good, and Wall Street has taken on Shackleton as a wonderful business and leadership example. He was also very good at picking the men who would be in a particular tent just to make sure that they were the ones who would get on well, or who would be balanced by the combination of characters.
So I think you would agree that restoring loyalty and the morale was the real key to their survival.
I think just optimism is what he gave them at the end of the day. You remember that he would not allow them to stockpile food. For instance, when they were in the Weddell Sea, they could have killed a lot of seals and frozen them. Shackleton said, we're not going to stockpile food, because that means my men are going to think we're going to spend the whole winter here or something like that. He always wanted his men to believe that they could get through, and he was always there to lead them through. He was first in line, always taking the hardest part of the trip.
The ultimate optimist.
Shackleton always said that optimism was the greatest attribute an explorer could have.
We began to crack and groan.
Did you hear the timbers going as the ice tightened?
Oh, you couldn't avoid it. It was there like heavy fireworks and blasting of guns.
If we can make 5 or 7 miles a day, our chance of reaching safety will be greatly increased. It will be much better for the men to feel they are on their way to land than to sit down and wait.
But after 3 days of hard slugging, they were still within sight of the ship. The march to land had proved futile. Now there was nothing to do but watch and wait.
You know, one of the amazing parts of this whole story, George, is Frank Hurley and the remarkable job that he did with the photography. Describe his style and his approach to subject matter and his efforts to save the negatives.
Frank Hurley was tough as nails, and it's an interesting attribute for a photographer. He was always dealing with 300 pounds of equipment. His early motion picture cameras had to be hand-cranked. If at any moment during the making of his photography or films, his skin outside of a glove touched the metal on the camera, it would rip his skin off because it would freeze to the metal. I just don't know how he did it, but he was always up on top of the mast getting the most remarkable shots.
During the day, I hacked through the thick walls of the refrigerator to retrieve the negatives stored therein. They were located beneath 4 feet of mushy ice. And by stripping to the waist and diving under, I hauled them out.
When the 3 small boats finished up their arduous journey to Elephant Island, he was right out of the boats in the surf, and at that point all he had left was a small vest pocket Kodak camera. He then succeeded in taking some of the best expedition pictures ever taken on the beaches of Elephant Island.
And there was a point in the expedition where Shackleton turned to him and forced him to abandon a lot of the negatives and film that he had shot.
Shackleton's belief was that if they didn't destroy the photographs, Hurley would have snuck back to get all of them out of there. And the problem was that there just was not enough freeboard on the boats to take a lot of heavy equipment. And believe it or not, those images were on glass plates, which meant that they were heavy. They had to be stored in sealed aluminum cases so they were very heavy. They would have been covered with ice, heavier yet. So Shackleton and Hurley conducted the greatest photo edit ever done, in my opinion, and they sat next to the sinking carcass of their ship, and Shackleton and Hurley would look at one glass plate negative after another, and if it was not absolutely terrific, they'd break it over their knees, and that was it. Although my fondest hope is that when Bob Ballard goes to the Antarctic to find the Endurance, maybe a couple of Hurley photographs that we've never seen will be found.
That would be exciting.
Under 8,000 feet of water.
Well, what new interesting things did you learn that you weren't aware of?
The single rule I learned from Shackleton, and it's one that I'd certainly considered before I ran into this story by necessity, is never give up. No matter what happens to you, you never give up. And if there were a single plaque that I could put over my desk from Shackleton, it would be those words, never give up. And it's pretty good stuff, because there's Shackleton, 1,500 miles from the nearest living person, marooned in the Antarctic, his ship is crushed, and suddenly he's living on 4 to 6 feet of ice over 8,000 feet of water, with really no probability that they would ever get back. I mean, it was real suicide time. Not at all. Shackleton got all of his men back, and that's what makes it the greatest survival story ever.
And the family motto, I believe, is by endurance we conquer?
That's correct.
Where did that come from?
I can't tell you where his family motto actually came from, but the original Shackletons were from Yorkshire, and probably some medieval knight came up with that family motto.
The weather was very thick in the morning. Indeed, at 7 a.m. we were right under the cliffs, which plunged sheer to the sea before we saw them.
Elephant Island. The men had been 7 bleak days at sea and over 5 months on drifting ice. It was a year and 4 months since they had touched land.
George, in your opinion, was the boat journey on the James Caird the most perilous and courageous part of the ordeal? And if so, why?
On balance, what the James Caird voyage showed probably is the most remarkable part of a very remarkable story. The big problem they had is that they had a very small boat without a keel. And if there are sailors in the audience, as I'm sure there are in Connecticut, you know that it's very hard to make a boat point if it doesn't have a keel, which means to give it any sense of direction at all. Furthermore, there were very few moments when the sun was actually showing. You need to see the sun in order to get a sextant reading. And when you see the sun, you need to balance that against the horizon, which is very difficult to do in a boat that's going like that, if not like that, the whole time. So they actually navigated by something called dead reckoning, which is almost a mystical way to navigate. Worsley was kind of accounting for the wind speed, kind of accounting for the swell in the ocean, kind of accounting for the drift and the tide, and simultaneously he was trying to figure out where South Georgia was. And he landed right dead center in the middle of South Georgia.
So they arrive on South Georgia Island, and then you describe almost a mystical crossing of the island, as if a fourth person was there along with them. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
The so-called Shackleton Traverse of South Georgia is remarkably difficult to do, more difficult than ever in Shackleton's time, because it's a glacier and series of glaciers, literally unknown territory that had never been crossed before. So there was no route for them to take. I've tried to cover this route myself in a helicopter, and the 6 times I tried to do it, we were always turned back by 60, 70 mile an hour winds. It's a route that has terribly bad weather. And Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean, who made this journey, had no equipment. They had no equipment. And to give you an idea of what they accomplished, for the purposes of my IMAX, which I also shot in the Antarctic, played at Mystic IMAX Theater, for instance, I took 3 of the greatest mountain climbers alive in the world today, Reinhold Messner and 2 of his companions, to the Antarctic. It took them 4.5 days to do what Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean did in 32 hours. And my modern mountain climbers had every possible piece of modern mountain climbing equipment, and they knew the route backwards and forwards. So you almost can't explain what Worsley and Shackleton and Crean did together, except that there is a sort of religious overtone to this. They claim that there was a 4th person with them on the entire traverse, and that is mystical.
So what we're to infer maybe is their intense and strong belief in God is what got them through the final leg of the journey.
Curiously enough, I find the Shackleton story to be very spiritual. But Shackleton was a Quaker, and there were no apparent church services during the course of the expedition. And they didn't arrive at Elephant Island and bow down and thank God, according to the records that we have. Simultaneously, only God, it seems, could have gotten them through their adversities. And it was as if they were put in the position of Job and then saved at the end, to give it a biblical context.
All hands were safe. Not one life had been lost. An ecstatic welcome greeted Shackleton in Punta Arenas. Although Germany was at war with Britain, the German community raised flags of celebration. The crew of the Endurance returned to a British nation that little resembled the one they had left 2 years before.
Tell us about Shackleton's life after he returned to Great Britain.
Well, you remember that Shackleton and his men set out on the very day that World War I broke out in Europe. At the beginning of the war, no one had any idea that it would go on and become what it became. So at the time where Shackleton and his men got back to England, the Battle of the Somme was going on in France in August of 1916, I believe. And there was a general sense that explorers weren't going to be popularized in the middle of a war. And there was a kind of growing sense that maybe Shackleton and his men had gotten out of the war, even though they all volunteered for military combat the moment they got back. So what really happened is that the men signed up and went off to join various regiments or serve in the Navy. But there was no great welcome in England, and Shackleton sort of bounced around in a sad kind of way when he got back from the Antarctic. He always said that his greatest role was with his men in the wilderness or the ice. And it must have been very difficult to come back from such a heroic adventure and fit in anywhere. And so Shackleton probably drank a little bit too much, smoked a little bit too much, and then in 1922 he got a hold of a boat called the Quest, and his men heard about this, and 8 of them signed up, and they headed back to the Antarctic.
As Shackleton had known, the Endurance expedition had been his last chance at glory. In 1921, he headed south once more, joined by a handful of the old Endurance crew: Worsley, Macklin, Green, Hussey, and Frank Wild. The goal of the expedition was unclear. All that mattered was that they were heading south again.
And to make a perfectly symmetrical story for me, the director, ironically, Shackleton lands in Grytviken Harbor, where the original expedition had begun, and dies that night.
And that was in 1921.
22.
22. And he was what age?
He would have been 47 or 48.
Died of a heart attack.
That's correct.
What do you think his goals were on this last trip?
Muddled. I think that he and his men had a great nostalgia for the Antarctic, and I can fully understand that. It's one of the most hauntingly beautiful places I've ever been, if not the most beautiful. And I just think they wanted to go back and stretch their sea legs and see Elephant Island again. And they did. They got back there. And the film that I made ends with the remnants of this expedition getting back to Elephant Island.
And do you think in some ways, George, they might have known that they were never going to come back again?
I can't answer that question because I can't put myself in their heads. I think that all of Europe was reeling from World War I, and probably a lot of America as well. It was an enormously formidable experience for everyone. And, to come back from the greatest survival story ever told and be confronted by World War I mean, those are 2 big blows for anyone to take.
Yeah, I was just thinking, it was almost as if they had come back to a world that maybe they just could not deal with any longer, and they needed to get back down to Antarctica for their own survival.
And you got to remember that the Antarctic is a friendly place. All of those seals and penguins have no fear of man, and it's beautiful, and the air is clear, and you can see for 100 miles.
Shackleton's own feeling about the Endurance expedition was expressed in his memoir. We had seen God in his splendors, heard the text that nature renders. We had reached the naked soul of man.
Well, thank you, George, for being our guest tonight. And thank you for watching another exciting episode of The Unconventional Traveler. And I hope you'll join us again next Tuesday night for another exciting story. Good night.